Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. And welcome to our session, Urban Health Challenges and Solutions, the Role of Nature. I think while everyone can agree that access to green space is a good thing for human health, I think we are only just beginning to understand the physical, mental, and communal impacts of urban green space on our health. With the world urbanizing faster and faster every single year, it is becoming increasingly important to understand how our cities are managing their green space and biodiversity to reduce spread, be resilient to climate change, and build stronger communities. So with all of that said, joining me now is a distinguished group of panelists. Kathy Karate, Citywide Director of Rodent Mitigation, or better known as the Rat Czar in New York City. Thanks for being here. Dr. Aruni Bhatnagar, Chief of the Division of Environmental Medicine and the Director of the Christina Lee Brown Envirome Institute at the University of Louisville. And Dr. Samuel Ramsey, Endowed Assistant Professor of Entomology at the University of Colorado, and the founder and director of the Ramsey Research Foundation. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to kick it off, and Kathy, I'd like you to start, and then Sammy, followed by Aruni, if you could follow in that order. I think while each of us can agree that nature is important, what has your individual scope and work shown are its actual effects on our mental, physical bodies?
Yeah, so the work I mainly focus on is around rats, which are considered a pest, and often seen as a nuisance issue, but there's real health concerns, both physical health and disease that they carry, but also adverse mental health effects. And we're just kind of scratching the surface on what this looks like. But rats enjoy urban spaces. They're urban exploiters. So the denser we get, the older our cities get, the more we see them exploiting these spaces, the more interfaces we have between rodents, rats, and humans, and the more potential we have for potential ill effects because of this close symbiosis, these relationships together.
Sammy?
So I am a pollinator biologist. I work with honeybees and a number of other pollinator species. And something that is very clear is that they are attuned to our mental health because they preserve the spaces that allow us to be healthy. Evolutionarily, we have evolved to be in green spaces, to be surrounded by verdant fields. That's just how it works. And these pollinators are so important for making these spaces the beautiful things that we can exist in and that can lower our sense of anxiety and depression. And so it's very important for us to make sure that they are healthy so that we can be healthy.
Well, the question whether nature is important for our health presupposes that the nature is different from who we are. We are actually not divorced from nature, but part of it. Every part, how we are inside, how we are outside is all nature. And so the question then becomes is, what forms of the nature, what environments that we are in are conducive to our health and well-being? And certainly natural environments, as you pointed out about, we evolved in these environments. Our body is used to exposure to all these various antigens, and those are the ones that make our immune systems more resilient and us healthier. And so in order for us to lead healthy lives, we need to be in communication and touch with this wider world, and that's what we study in the Envirome Institute.
Well, and Rooney, I want to stick with you here. You've done a lot of work with the Environment Institute in experimenting on what do different green spaces look like in urban environments. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned.
So there is a sort of large experiment that we are doing, and I wanted to show you some pictures about those.
Sure.
And in that, what we are doing is we took a neighborhood, and within this neighborhood, we have actually created spaces that we call the target areas. And in these target areas are the ones that we plant trees. They're surrounded by these areas called control areas. So this is like a clinical trial. And in the clinical trial, instead of giving people a drug, we put trees in the neighborhood. And since we cannot put like small trees, it'll take 30 years or so to grow, we put very large trees. And then follow what happens to the health of the community, the levels of air pollution, and to the community neighborhood interactions, and see what are the exact effects of the trees. And so here you can see that we have to really plant large trees that would be able to then be planted to different places. We go to homes, every home, and then we put these little signs for participation with the different places. We can then plant these trees outside people's homes. And then in the end, we can actually convert these areas from something looking like this to areas that are actually greened in that sense. We have to change the soil in the area, and then we have to actually transport these large trees there. And ultimately, this would get us to a place where we would be able to create a barrier between a neighborhood and the green spaces.
You know, Kathy, we're going to get to your scope in just a second, but I'm wondering, just given your role in New York City, and when you see what Aruni is experimenting with, does some of this seem, well, of course, this is something that we should be doing, or how much of this is knowledge acquisition that we need to inform what you do in New York City more broadly?
Yeah, I know Rooney has spoken to the parks team in New York City, and New York City has a robust street tree program. We have almost over 700,000 street trees. So more greenery in more neighborhoods, the climate impacts, the health impacts. The part that prickles for me, and Aruni and I spoke about this right before we came up, is the ongoing maintenance. Because typically when I'm brought into a situation, it's when things have devolved and we have rats exploiting human behaviors or lack of human behaviors. So the greening of cities, more trees, more green spaces, but then partnered with the education and understanding of the general public, and then the ongoing maintenance of these spaces, because very quickly, if there's a food source associated with them, they become rat habitat. And I think then that can disillusion people thinking green spaces mean pests, and what the science shows is green spaces are better for our health. We need to make sure there's a maintenance plan in place.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a really critical point. 50% of the trees that planted in urban areas don't survive after 5 years. Being in urban areas is a very harsh environment and not very conducive to trees. So maintenance is a key issue. We devoted a significant amount of resources in trying to preserve these trees. Just to plant these trees, because they're so big, it costs us over $8 million. And we have to spend almost $1 million per year to maintain them, because they decay, they fall. And some of the homeless people congregated on the trees that we planted, and they burned these trees for heat. So these things happen. This is real life. And so, point well taken. I think more and more cities that, when they plant trees, should preemptively have a maintenance plan.
Sammy, insects are the cornerstone of a healthy biodiversity. I think
Accurate.
What role? Let's zoom out a little bit. What role do not only insects, but having a healthy biodiversity play in the health of our cities?
So biodiversity is, well, I'm sure some of you have heard that individuals are contending against the idea that diversity has any merit. Some of it has been articulated as it's all just diversity for diversity's sake. And there truly is no such thing. If you were to ever see what happens in the biological world when any sort of biological pathogen rips through a community, the only thing that keeps that community together is that there is diversity, there are individuals in that space that are able to deal with that perturbation. So issues that we deal with now, like we are dealing with issues with banana crops and so on, it's because we have no diversity in those plants. Now consider the diversity of a community of plants in an ecosystem where people are living. It keeps those ecosystems robust. Consistently, the healthiest ecosystems are the most robust ones. Now, insects are the most diverse group of organisms on this planet. They are incredible. Close to 80% of the animals on this planet are insects. They are incredibly successful, and as a result, they have found more than 1 million ways of interacting with the environment and finding their own niche. They have their own job that they consistently do that keeps that ecosystem going. When you start removing those pieces in the system, the ecosystem becomes unbalanced, it becomes unhealthy, and you start seeing all kinds of problems that then crop up in this system. Plants dying, the impact that has on the existence of those green spaces, other creatures getting out of control where you have swarms of mosquitoes descending on people that would normally be controlled by other insects in the environment that aren't anymore. We need to make sure that our ecosystems continue to be robust, and the insects are the canaries in the coal mine.
Hey, Sammy, I've heard you speak a few times, and I think you do such a good job explaining that. But I'm wondering, do you think there's a lay understanding of the ways in which insects impact biodiversity and what that means, say, for our food supply?
As somebody who studies bees, I get really excited when I see the way that people react to the concept of bees. I mean, we've got people dressing up like bees. We've got all kinds of videos online of people having little bottles of sugar water in their pocket, and they're like, I'm going to save the bees. Things are getting a little bit out of hand, though, because some of the zeal is outpacing the actual knowledge of what's going on. Like a lot of these people who are feeding bees, I'm like, sweet thing, that bee was just cold. You and your sugar water have done nothing. But in some ways, the lay understanding, the lay connection that people have with nature, it's an excitement about nature that often outpaces the knowledge of what it is that we can do to make things better. One of the things that everybody in this room can do to make sure that the pollinator population that exists around them is robust and healthy is to provide them with food or shelter, because they need many of the same things that we do. So some of you might be thinking, well, in urban spaces, that's going to be very hard to come by. You can hang a garden box outside of your window. Just 1 square foot of flowers can feed more than 1,000 pollinators. So plant some flowers, y'all. Because I don't know who poisoned our mind and got us thinking that just green everywhere, just a lawn that is just grass, is the best thing out here. It is not. We need dandelions popping up and all kinds of the things that you think of as weeds, because they're actually supporting the population. And this is the kind of information that needs to get into the lay populace's mindset about how to help these organisms.
Rooney, I want you to lay on top of that. What's your reaction?
So, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. So, biodiversity is very important and essential for its sake, but it's also very essential for the sake of human health. And one of the things that we are doing within the Green Heart Project is measuring biodiversity and how that is changing with planting new plants and trees there. And we're looking for bees, we're looking for arthropods, we're looking for bats and butterflies. We have students come out in the night and they start, recording all the bat sounds. They start working 10 in the late night until 3 in the morning, recording bat sounds. So we want to follow biodiversity very well. There is this whole idea that it's called the old friends hypothesis, that we actually grew up or evolved with these other things, so our body needs to know them. And part of the autoimmune disease and diseases in urban environments is because of divorce from nature. And we know that kids who actually are in farms, who play with pigs and play in the dirt, have virtually very low rates of asthma and autoimmune disease and so on. Whereas kids that are in these sterile, clean environments are more susceptible to disease. So all this time we had this debate about how good biodiversity is. Now we need to put in human health in it and understand how critical it is for our own well-being.
Yeah.
If I could share, Sammy, what made me think when you said that enthusiasm for bees, I wish I had that parallel in my work. Enthusiasm for taking action, and your point directly taken, for pest rats in particular, they're looking for the same things, food source and a place to live. And our cities are perfectly designed, unlike our pollinator species, which are being slowly, built out of our urban centers. For rats, we're building even better urban centers for them. So I think the mirroring, and I'm hearing this public engagement and how do we educate and talk about this, is there's a role the public has to play, and that role can be dependent on what type of animals, what kind of ecosystem are we trying to promote or dispromote in our cities, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. We know that for biodiversity. We know that in urban centers. We know that for human communities. And I think there's a lot of excitement, but how do we turn that excitement into the right kind of action?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Kathy, I'm going to stick with you. Your work every day is on the ground in the biggest city in the country, tackling a very difficult problem. Talk to us about what solutions you've seen to, I think, a problem that maybe we've all seen to some degree, but don't obviously have a clear solution for. What's working right now?
Yeah, I think the exciting thing about rats, and follow me on the journey, is most people have an experience with it, so it's easily relatable. Really what we're focusing on in New York City, we take an approach called integrated pest management, and that's looking holistically at the issue. It is not unique to pest. It's used a lot in insect species as well. And it's thinking about, we're really focusing on how we can get front-end equation pieces. Rats are prolific breeders. We know from the science we cannot exterminate our way out of the problem, but historically that's been the approach that's been taken. Come in, put some rodenticide down, exterminate, come back again and again and again. And we're really working on system-scaled changes to make sure we're addressing food sources, harborage conditions, that's places they live, and really public engagement to get that out to our 8.5 million New Yorkers, really doing a strong push with collaboration on the public sector, and then really a strong olive branch out to our private property owners, because the work of rats, like the work of ecosystem building, is community-based. One person can do it right, amazing. The whole block needs to do it right if we really want to see an impact.
You know, I was going to say, and I want to come back, and Rooney, I'm going to bring this back to you. Take a moment, just for the audience. How'd you end up in your role?
Yeah, I did not go to school to be a rat czar. That's, I think, what I've been thinking about a lot is we don't know the careers that will be there in 10, 15 years. Changing climate, changing health, changing human population. My background educationally is biology. That's my undergrad degree, so studying life. I was an elementary school teacher for a while, so I think, how do we translate concepts to their lowest level for understanding and inclusion? And then I went back to school for sustainability, really thinking about humans, how we build our cities, and then how we interact in those spaces. And really the appeal to me for this job was this confluence of living, non-living, built, and human interaction. That's the excitement. I did a lot of work. I worked for New York City Public School System, and I ran the waste program there. So I did operational components with waste and programmatical components with waste. And if you're in the world of rats, garbage and rats go hand in hand, and that was kind of my direct line into working with rats.
That's great. Thank you for that. Rooney, I want to bring it back to you and just build on what we were talking about with Kathy. You've done work with the Green Heart Project, measuring the impacts of targeted greening in communities. How can green spaces be built to create the greatest impact for human health?
Yes, so the short answer is we don't know, and that's part of the experiment. We've always planted trees in every major city in the United States, but across the world. They're trying to plant trees because trees are good, they look good, they provide shade, they have other ecosystem services that are very well understood. But what we really do not understand is what is the link between health and green spaces. So when you have more trees, does it mean that there's more biodiversity? Does it mean that trees increase human health by promoting people to spend more time outdoors? Or whether they help by reducing temperature, pollution, and noise, and light pollution? So we have to sort out each of these what we call mechanisms, to then be able to attribute specific reasons why trees are good for us. And that's important because if we're going to plant trees, for example, I was showing you here, to remove air pollution, they have to be planted in certain geometry. We can't just go in a street and plant lollipop trees, because then what happens is all the emissions from cars' tailpipe accumulate in the understory, and it makes things worse rather than better. So you have to plant small bushes and the large trees and so that they can ease the air pollution off the road and not accumulate it in the road itself. So that's when you plant trees for pollution. When you plant trees, for example, heat, we have trees which are very evaporative, which will cool the surface. And they have different geometry that helps with temperature than with pollution. So this is a whole new concept of what we call evidence-based planting. And only when we do that can we test whether or not these trees are being effective for our health and why.
Sammy, you talked about daffodils. I'm wondering if just hearing what Rooney is mentioning, does that resonate in terms of the approach, and are you seeing that in more places across the country?
I'm actually seeing people get pretty excited about initiatives like No Mow May, where you're not supposed to mow your lawn for the month of May to allow for the pollinators to have the food that they need. Our pollinators are actually dependent consistently on plants that we like to think of as weeds. And a weed has no real scientific definition. It's just, I don't particularly like that plant. It looked at me wrong. It's a weed now. So as a result of that, there are plants that some people are getting rid of. They don't even know why, but they know that someone called it a weed, and they're trying to get rid of it. And so trying to get people to better understand the importance of some of these plants, the fact that many of them are among the first to appear in the spring, and they provide a food source to bees at a time where they don't have a diversity of foods to consume. In urban settings, around people's homes, we kind of need to educate them about why these plants are actually important and why they don't need to be destroyed.
It's interesting just hearing all of you speak. We've talked about greening, targeted green spaces. Mm-hmm. Kathy, obviously, your scope in New York City. Do we think, just amongst you three, that there is a sense, and this is to all of you, starting with Rooney, that we have a sense of how to build the built environment in a city, the hardscape? How do we Where do we place playgrounds? Other sort of areas that can promote physical activity. Do we have a blueprint for that for newer cities or cities that are growing, Rooney?
No, not really, not in specifics. But I want to go back to a larger point, which is that we are working on an area of think that in order to promote human health and prevent human disease, there have to be systemic changes, and the built environment plays a critical role in maintaining human health. So we create healthy environments. And we have some sense, we're beginning to learn how to create more urban spaces that are green, that are clean, that have biodiversity, they have time to be outside. So we know I think the frame, we don't know the details.
Kathy?
Yeah, I think the piece I'd add is more and more people live in cities. You alluded to that to start. Our cities are getting older. So I think of it less of how do we build new and how do we modify existing, both from thinking, again, from the pest management world, how are we, choosing plants that are biodiversity favorable, but not favorable to the pests that might inhabit those areas? How are we thinking about exclusion techniques? So building better back with what we have and thinking of how these components come together, really thinking of the city as a whole, which is made up, the sum of its parts, different neighborhoods, different pockets, different interactions of health and community.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we talked about bees, and bees are great, but I'm an equal opportunity entomologist, I'd like y'all to know. So I work with all the insects. The bees just pay the bills. So let's talk about some of the other bugs that have gotten into these spaces and have made things kind of weird, because we don't always build things with them in mind. I have spent a fair amount of time working with organisms like bed bugs and cockroaches, the kinds of creatures that make people start scratching when you talk to them in a room like this. Some of you have started already. They thrive on their capacity to actually walk between the walls of multi-unit housing. And so our ability to create fewer pest entry points, our ability to seal up those pipes and those wires that they use as a thoroughfare between locations is really important. And it's very hodgepodge, depending on what city you're in, whether people are aware of this and what can be done about it. But it is very important for human health for people to not constantly have to deal with bed bugs or cockroaches. And that's one of the things that we need to manage as well, because there's a protein that's in the exoskeleton of cockroaches, BLAG1, that actually can cause asthma, and not just trigger asthma in people that have it, but in children that are being exposed to it as they are developing, actually cause asthma for them. So there are elements of human health where we really need to be more aware of the spaces that we are sharing with these organisms that are very, very, very attuned to our biology.
Yeah, can I add to that? I think that's an interesting point. And the thing is, we all say we need more nature. We want to get nature back in the cities. But nature is just not, all interactions with nature not pleasant, as you know.
Not always.
not always. And so it is red in tooth and claw. So if I grew up in India, and if I say, I want to go spend our time in the jungle, into a wilderness there, I'll be dead in 5 minutes with the scorpions and the tigers and the snakes and the cobras. Here, it is a much more tamed wilderness. So these are woods, not jungles. So when we bring nature back into the cities, we have to make a deliberate effort to curate nature, bring in the elements of nature that are conducive to us, and keep other elements out. The whole purpose of being civilized, making cities in the first place, was to keep nature at bay. So this strikes at the very root of the motive of being civilized. But now we know better, and we can bring nature back in a way that we can live with and wouldn't be scared of nature.
I'm telling you, that can be taken out of context. Some people would be like, wait a minute now, Aspen Ideas Health, keeping nature at bay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Nature could be very dangerous.
Yes, it can be.
I think it gets to the idea of, what animals are considered of value or not. And your point to the dandelion, which is a flower, a species that feeds pollinators, but to many is seen as a detriment. And I'm not advocating for more pests in our city, but in this inclusive thinking of how are we building our cities, maintaining our cities, living in our cities, and who are we welcoming intentionally or unintentionally into those spaces? And then how do we make plans? I think that right on line with you in the multifamily buildings, and how are we securing them against, invasive pests into those spaces? But who gets to decide, who's welcome and who's not? I think we have a lot of good research certainly around, I know, roaches and asthma, a lot of other pests, but there's a lack of information in a lot of these spaces, a lack of research of what is the risk, what is the reward, and how do we make an educated plan to deal with this in our cities and our governance.
This is good discussion. So for the audience, I know we had a few folks walk in, this urban health challenges and solutions, the role of nature. We've been focusing a lot on building better cities, and as we move the conversation on a bit, I do want, what's one prescription each of you would give? Let's say you're invited to G20 next year, to global heads of state. What's the one thing, as 70% of human Earth now moves towards a city? We're urbanizing again. 70% we're going to be living in urban environments. What's one thing that's not getting talked enough about when we talk about a healthier built environment? Aruni?
Okay, I can start. Of course, I'll say we need evidence-based planting. We just can't plant trees wherever we want, or whatever tree, wherever. We need to have an evidence-based planting schemes and truly understand what is our relationship with nature to be able to nurture and evolve the relationship within our cities. For long, we have like these parks that people can go to there. So greenness was our nature, somewhere we visit. But we need nature on our doorsteps, but we need to understand how and where. So that's what I wanted.
That's great. Kathy, please.
If I only get one, I think I'd lean to sanitation and thinking about waste systems, and I'd wrap that up into, services provided to a city. That includes ecosystem services, and empowering individuals to feel more ownership in those spaces.
Mine would be for us to consider how we use chemicals in our control of species that we are not particularly interested in having around. There are a lot of insects out there that are controlled with chemicals consistently. Even in some areas, mosquitoes are consistently controlled in this way, when a much better way of controlling them would be to get rid of their breeding ground. If you just stop people from discarding tires and allowing those tires to fill up with water when it rains, you will stop the mosquitoes from being able to go through the most critical part of their life cycle, and then you won't have to spray anything. And that kind of reduction of our pesticide footprint would be really great for the environment, but it requires us to educate people about where mosquitoes come from. When they're not aware of that, they can't take the steps necessary to mitigate that connection.
So if we transitioning to urban health and social health, I want to talk a little bit about education, because it strikes me that most of the lay public probably doesn't get to hear the three of you talk about these topics, or maybe a surrogate talk about these topics all that often. Sammy, lean into education a bit. What should we be doing more when it comes to educating people on taking ownership on what their built environment could look? I mean, is there an opportunity there, and what does that look like in terms of education?
I like that. Sammy, lean into education. You don't have to tell me twice. Now, as a professor, leaning into education is my job. But then when I am not at work, it's still just a part of who I am. So this morning, we went on a nature walk and just walked around the area, identifying different organisms that exist in that space. And that is an opportunity to connect with people and let them know, oh, check it out. These ladybugs that are all over this plant are the best way to prevent these kinds of plants from being taken down by aphids. Rather than going into your garden and spraying all kinds of pesticides to get rid of some of the insects that are getting on your nerves, there are other insects that will do that job for you, and they are a self-propagating system. You can put them there, they will start new populations, and you don't have to buy them again. So letting people know about these sorts of things often involves connecting with them, and unfortunately, as scientists, that's not really been our thing. Now, the system of science has consistently self-selected for individuals who do not want to interact with other individuals. We need to talk about that. We really do need to talk about that. The idea has been that as a scientist, I can silo myself in that red brick building over on the one side of campus, and when I do need to communicate my science, it will be for me to put a paper in a journal that no one will ever read. And that's the system that has consistently been the way that we interact as scientists. But then what do we see in 2020? A whole bunch of scientists running out of their labs saying, hey, everybody, trust me, listen to me, I know what's going on. And we're like, what? No, I'm going to listen to that guy that I saw in the Fast and Furious movies, because he's on TikTok now telling me that if I inhale hot water, that I can burn all the COVID out of my nose. True story. Tyrese was out here telling y'all that if you just inhale evaporated water with salt in it, it will kill all the COVID in your nose. And plenty of people were listening to this rather than the scientists whose bread and butter, their job was to actually convey this information. But when people don't know you, don't trust you, and don't understand what it is that you're doing, what reason do they have to listen to you? So the most important part of this connection, I mean, just going out with people and doing that nature walk today was a great experience because it allowed me to connect with people outside of my job as a scientist, but just on a very personable and human level.
Kathy, react to that, just vis-a-vis especially rodent populations, how it impacts social health. What are we not knowing that we need to know?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, education, engagement. I love to use our city as a living lab in a different way than Aruni does, and go out with groups and experience the city with them to show them the exact interactions. Where are our pests? Where are our rats? Where's their food source? And I've had the feedback. I think it's about building trust because there's so much misconception about wildlife, I'll call it, biological animals and who's responsible for what. And I think being able to visit it in situ and understand how this all relates gives people power, gives people a voice and a platform to have those conversations. And I think that's really the power in leaning into education and engagement is the capacity building. The three of us, and I'm with you, articles are amazing. How do we bring them to life? Because they live in their vacuum and very few people know about them, and misconception runs rampant around rats in particular. But if we can, each one teach one, bring a group out, look at this together, understand the system, understand how it functions, and now they're talking about it, that does the work for us. And I think it also empowers people in a way that they now feel part of the solution rather than another cog in the wheel.
So I agree. I think the communication is key, and I agree with you that scientists have not done as good a job as they should have been doing out of the lab, and maybe that's their job. They should be in the lab, do this stuff, and we need somebody else who can communicate this to the public. But what I would want to communicate, if I was more sort of articulate about that, would be that we are essentially open systems. We are in constant touch with nature. We are breathing air, we're drinking water, we're eating food. We are open systems. And we need to realize that we are not an entity on our own, but open to whatever is around us. And we need to teach ourselves, other people and children. We learned this through COVID. The importance of being outside, the importance of being in sunshine. If children are not exposed to 6 hours of direct sunlight, their eyes cannot form. And so we have all these children wearing glasses when they're 6 years old because of lack of sunlight exposure. If we do not have enough sunlight exposure, we can't form strong bones. If we are even off by 1 hour on the circadian rhythm within the sun and the daylight and the night cycle, we have a tax to pay, and the risk of diabetes develops just by being 2 hours mismatched. So this is how closely we are entrained and wedded to nature. And if we can communicate that as first step of being healthy and first step in our well-being is to get our connection with nature right.
That's great. I want to come one last question on this topic. We're going to close on climate change, but I do want to remember, just a reminder to the audience, we're going to have some time at the end for some Q&A, so we'd love to hear from you. So please do think of any questions you might like to ask the panelists. Just as we think about social health, it doesn't get lost on me as a pulmonologist that the communities in a large city that tend to have the worst air quality are also the most underserved, have the least green space. And I'm wondering, Sammy, first, maybe if you can take this, and then Aruni, I'd love your thoughts, and then Kathy at the end. How do we solve this? You guys are adding so much knowledge to this space. How do we convince policymakers that we're going to actually have change across all zip codes?
Sir, did you just ask me to solve racism? Because that's a tall order. That's a tall order. If I may, there is no good reason why the green spaces have to be located in simply the areas where there are white people. The reasoning behind it is that we have huge issues with systemic racism, and while some of the policies that have put these problems in place have abated, the actual problems that they've caused are things that we don't want to touch. So there was a time where the redlining was just the law of the day. You do not give mortgages to black people in any of these good areas. We will cluster them all in these regions, and that's where all the black people will live. Well, redlining is now illegal, but we never fixed that problem. We never did anything to restructure the system such that that's not the case. And there was a reason why Plessy versus Ferguson fell. We had this perspective that separate could not be equal. But we never actually implemented that in the ways that housing is structured. We're still separate. Mm-hmm. We're still unequal. We still don't get the green spaces. We get the messed up looking public libraries with very few resources. We get the terrible public parks that are poorly maintained. And that, my friend, that's systemic racism. Systemic racism has been around for a long time. Every time I look around the corner, I'm like, is that you again? Mm-hmm. Systemic racism. Are you following me? Lord, have mercy. Yeah. So all of that to say, that is going to require changes in policy. That is going to require political will. That's going to require us not to re-elect Donald Trump. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Kathy, yeah, you're in government right now. Talk to us about a policy that makes sure that some change that you're inputting right now reaches more, not less.
Yeah, we're trying to really take a data-driven approach of where do we have these issues and target resources there. And you're right, we're battling systems, mm-hmm. systems that are serving exactly who they're designed to serve. So we're talking, change in governance, change in policy, change in operations, and really being intentional about making sure we're gathering the right information and then putting into action the changes we think are going to make an impact there, rather than a blanket approach, or the approach that's been used historically is those with the loudest voices. Mm-hmm. And we're really being intentional about voices are part of the equation, but not the whole piece of the equation. Where do we have issue? Where do we have infrastructure? Where do we have multifamily housing that's not doing what it needs to do? And going deep there while making the changes at a system scale to hopefully, a high tide rising all boats, but really focusing on our areas where we have had inequity and we know there's a higher burden.
Yeah, and I would agree. And so in penny cities, New Orleans, Chicago, even Louisville, the life expectancy between one end of the city and the other could be off by 20 years, and and there are many, many reasons contributing to that. So we need to, in some sense, realize that that's not an acceptable state of affairs, and then we have to figure out what are the reasons driving that. There are lots of reasons. There is systemic racism. There's a lot of racism is not systemic. Mm-hmm. It's just individual racism, and it's very pernicious and very sort of prevalent. But we have to address it on a societal, cultural level. But we also do things that we can do at a systemic level, rather than blame the people that you can't take care of your neighborhood. We went to these neighborhoods and we asked them, "We're going to plant trees there." Mm-hmm. They couldn't believe. There was the red line neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Nobody could believe that somebody would come to this neighborhood and do something good for them without any ulterior motive. And they said, "What do you want? Do you want some money? Do you want us to write our home to you?" No, we just wanted to come and help you make this a healthier neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And nobody's ever done that to them. Mm-hmm. And so there are resources and there are ways systemically to be able to change, at least in a small measure. There was a study showing that if you correct for greenness, the death inequity rates in cities almost disappears. So maybe being green and being a more pleasant neighborhood where you have a sense of belonging, you're proud to be in a place where you are. There is this whole broken window hypothesis. Once you have one window is broken, the whole neighborhood goes down. Mm-hmm. And so there are things that can be done with policy, greening, sanitation, access to fresh foods and vegetables, and transportation. Things like that could really make a very big difference.
That's for sure. And if I may, one policy that I think is really important for us to work on changing, and it's less of a policy and simply the way that we have things structured with our taxes, but the fact that property taxes pay for our schools will always contribute to a system of inequality and a caste system in the United States. We like to look at other countries and say, oh, look at the way they have that caste system over there. What are we doing? When we have it systemically structured such that if you happen to be from a low-income neighborhood, your schools will get less investment, your students will not be as well educated, and likely they will not be able to pursue the sorts of opportunities that happen just across the boundary line in another county. I am from Prince George's County, Maryland. I am from, PG. And unfortunately, as one of the things that does consistently happen in that county, you see in some of the poorer areas of that county, the school system is really not quite robust. So I went to one of the worst schools in the state of Maryland. I had to teach myself several subjects because we didn't have a teacher for physics or for chemistry or for calculus. And so in order for me to then go from there to Cornell, where I did my undergraduate education, I had to simply teach myself these subjects. Everybody doesn't have the time, the capacity, or the support that I had from my parents to be able to do that. And people tell me all the time, well, you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. Why can't they? First of all, don't use me to further enact racism. I'm not the one for that. This is not it. But secondly, we should not have to. The fact that other people get to exist in a space where they're consistently provided the resources that they need means that everyone should be able to exist in a space where they are provided the resources that they need. So since we know that this is a problem, we should focus on fixing that, because we love to say that education is the great equalizer, but that is untrue. Equal education is the great equalizer, and we do not have that.
That's really well said, Sammy. Thank you. Thank you. Here, here. I want to open it up to audience questions. Perfect. Right here in the front row. Let's start it off and see if we can get to as many as possible.
My question's for Aruni. You should have seen it coming. Aruni, how do you guarantee that your projects to make greener spaces don't turn into gentrified spaces?
Yes, that is an important question. We have been following that very closely. We actually have a person who works with us as a whole project looking at gentrification. There are many ways of improving a neighborhood. So first of all, the alternatives leave the neighborhood as it is not a possibility. We have to help, and if we can, make a difference to the neighborhood. The second thing is that there could be some things could be done systematically. For example, fixing the taxes in the neighborhood and the houses, so that just because we make it better, prettier, greener, that this house prices don't go up. Right. Second thing is that we want people to adopt that. So it's something that was not imposed upon them, that they wanted to do it themselves. When we went to the neighborhood, before we did anything, we asked them, what is your priority for neighborhood? Of course, they said, drugs and crime. And the second thing was that we want to have a neighborhood more green. So that was the most positive thing that they wanted and dreamt about their neighborhood. And we said, okay, we can help you with that. And maybe as other things, we even know that where the green spaces are, crime rates decrease, drug use decreases, suicide rate decreases, birth outcomes are better. So if we can get people to own that space, and that is what they did, and into their own surroundings, then there's a sense of belonging, and we think we can keep gentrification at bay.
Thank you. Let's go over here. We're going to try to get to this.
Thank you. It's not just doing it for the people and asking them what they want, it's engagement, and it works both ways. And I think that that's where some of these projects fail, because it doesn't really empower people if they're just sitting and watching the machines out there. But if they can get their children out there to do some planting, if you can educate them about what happens when your trash is out there, I mean, that's really what we need in the world, is it working two ways. It's a two-way street.
Exactly right. We had a group there where was at least 50 people employed from the neighborhood to help us plant all these trees. We had people come and volunteer to help us plant. We asked for 30, 40 volunteers. We got 200 volunteers. Right. And people come in there and help and participate, so very critical.
And Kathy, maybe just reaction on education and
Yeah, I think it's
management.
essential to any neighborhood work, urban work, because if there's not that inherent trust and ownership, initial success maybe doesn't become long-term success. And that's a pillar of what we're doing in New York City around, rat mitigation, is making sure communities are engaged, empowered, have the information we have, and then work together in partnership to address those issues. I say it all the time, it's my title to do this work, but the truth is I cannot do the work alone, the city cannot do the work alone, and having that understanding with the public is vital to sustainable success.
That's great. I see right over there with the bracelets. Yep, perfect.
So for starters, I think it's interesting, the framing of nature versus us, because we actually are animals and we're all part of nature. So there's something in the communication strategy but most certainly in the US, but globally, I think that needs to shift. But I'm going to go back to pesticides and poisons, because I think there's a lot of research being done on the cutting edge on how to use nature to mitigate the use of poison. And poison and pesticides are so bad on our health and the human body. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more how you think about that. And then when it comes to suburbia, when it comes to lawns, we all know it's zero tolerance for biodiversity. So why don't we ban lawns in suburbia and create like beautiful natural wildfire gardens and get rid of the lawnmowers that look like Israeli tanks?
Yeah, I agree. And I think Sammy spoke a lot about the use of pesticides in agricultural applications. We face it in the world of rodent control. Rodenticides have been the hallmark of that industry for decades, and really looking to switch. And you're absolutely accurate. There's more and more journals coming out, our scientists, but we're bringing them out to the world so they can tell the story about how secondary effects are hurting less human health, but more raptors, other animals, and really thinking about how we switch the narrative around this work. So in New York City, we're working to deploy more and more extermination techniques that do not use rodenticide. Extermination will always be part of the toolkit we have in managing rodent populations, but approaching it in different ways where we don't have rodenticide as our only application. But there's a private partnership here too. If you own homes or exist in spaces, you're probably familiar with the services that extermination companies provide. Not different than a cell phone service. Every month you pay a bill, they provide a service. That service is not typically based, or historically hasn't been based, in how do we address these underlying issues, but rather addressing the acute issues that come up. And to Sammy's point, then what we get to is ongoing treatment rather than building a robust either biodiversity plan or exclusion plan, integrated pest management plan to address this wholesale. I am also not pro-lawn, so I think more policy, more education to push us away from these flat spaces, these flat green spaces that aren't providing a benefit to the environment is the path we should be taking down when we think about holistic approach to wellness.
And there is where good policy can help, because in the cities in California, they're trying to encourage rewilding of the lawns, and they would give you tax cuts if you would take out part of your lawn and then plant some native grasses or something, because lawns are a huge problem in terms of decreasing biodiversity.
They certainly are, and they are a huge drain on our water resources. The amount of water that it takes to be sprayed on these lawns to keep them as green as they are in a place where we are in a desert to begin with is absolutely staggering. In addition to that, a difficulty, well, 3 words, HOA. Now, HOAs have had a very, very, very strong they've strong-armed people into maintaining these lawns as these jade wastelands that are of no help in terms of biodiversity for our pollinators and many of the other organisms that would take refuge and would be able to find food in these spaces. We also have a lot of weed killer companies that have done a spectacular job of advertising in such a way where they've shamed people into believing that having anything on their lawn that is not just grass is a problem. And it has worked very effectively, which means we need to be better at counter-messaging and making sure that we as scientists and public speakers find our way onto platforms that people are listening to, like Instagram and so on.
We have time for one more question, and then if the speakers are willing to stick around maybe after, just for sure. Additional engagement. The gentleman with the iPad.
Okay. Hey, I'm Tyler. I'm originally from Mississippi. And I know this conversation is a lot about urban areas, but I do want to bring into the room our rural areas. Again, where I'm at in Mississippi, there's a lot of commodity crops growing, soybean, cotton, and it's normal to see a crop duster with pesticides going over fields. We're near the Mississippi River, so mosquitoes are rampant to the point where every day during the summer there's a mosquito truck going around spraying pesticides in the air. And so just because we're rural doesn't mean we're inherently linked to nature. In many cases, we are more disconnected from nature, and that is more dangerous to our community and our health. So I just wanted to bring that into this space.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that comment. We have time for one more question. Maybe right middle aisle here, if we could. maybe a quick question directed to one of our speakers.
Yeah, I think any of you, I'll just let you.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm a physician and I'm thinking about climate and health, and I'm often having to translate some of this science to legislators to get at the policy issue. And one question that keeps coming up is, do we have some metrics in terms of outcome data of, planting tiny forests in this amount of space can save this many lives, or it can save this much money? Do we have that kind of research, and where is that research headed?
Yes, there is one value which, so not for microforests, but for other values. It's a little fuzzy, but the data is that planting one tree in the backyard of a home improves the health of that household as if you would increase their annual income by $18,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's, wow.
Okay. It's a great one.
Last word, Sammy?
No,
Kathy?
I was just saying that's a
it's-
great statement to end on.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Aruni, Kathy, Sammy, for being here. Thank you to all of you.